Hi, I thought it was time for a little wrap up, as they say, of the books I read in February. It's the 27th. Tomorrow I'm off to Dorset again, another visit to Bob down there, this time with Jules Burts. You'll see that probably a bit later in the week. And I read some other stuff, but I've got 5 SF novels show I read in the last month. I'm going to talk you through them. This is roughly the order I read them in. And the tagline for this video, where I ask the question, is this the science fiction novel of 2023, is going to be about In Ascension by Martin Macinnes. So I'm going to leave that till the end because it's the one I want to discuss the most. I'll pass to the others probably more swiftly. First of all, Ian MacDonald, Desolation Road, which came out at the end of the 80s, caused quite a big splash. I think it was published in the States first before it was published in the UK. There was a Drunken Dragon limited edition. This is the Bantam paperback. I never fancied it at the time, and my friend Graham sort of badgered me to read it on and off over the years. And I got this paperback from him probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And MacDonald's got a great sort of reputation. Never really fancied his stuff, I don't know why. It's about 350 pages long. And I picked it up just off the top of a TBR pile. And what is it about? Well, Graham said to me, it's about trains on Mars. Well, that's one aspect of it. And there are similarities to Martian Chronicles. There are certainly similarities in tone and the sort of cod sort of whimsicality to the works of Cordwainer Smith. If you like Cordwainer Smith, you probably like this. My problem with it was that it was too long. I've read other things by him as well, and he does write very well. The writing is charming and beautiful, and I have to say, my general feeling about this book is that even though I didn't finish it because I got the point where I'd sort of had enough. It was like having sort of biscuits, and instead of eating a whole packet, I just had 3 or 4, and it was enough really. But I really like the writing. It's a good book. It's just not a book for me. And usually I either come down and say, no, I don't like that. I don't think much of that. Or I think, yeah, this was great. But this was halfway. Got lots of great characters, very imaginative, very witty, very colourful, sort of like a planetary romance. And my problem with it was that really it felt like a fix-up. It was episodic and a series of stories rather than a novel. And maybe it comes together at the end. If I've missed something, do point it out. But life is short and I didn't really feel the need to go on with it. I will read other things by him, I think. And as I say, the writing's absolutely charming and lovely and beautifully done, really good. But it was just too long for me. I suspect that if I read some short stories by him, I'd really like them as individual pieces. So that's Desolation Road. It's a Gollancz masterwork now, so it's sort of recognised sort of classic. And that was his first novel. He's had loads and loads of acclaim. So, you know, if you like the more ornate things, then that's probably going to be your jam. Then I read something which I absolutely loved, and it's by, admittedly, a favourite writer, and I hadn't read anything by him for some time, and I sort of dropped off with him in the sort of late 80s after a book he did called The Businessman, which I didn't essentially get on with. I'm going to go back to it, and this was the book which followed, which is called The Priest, by Thomas M. Disch. This came out about 94, and I picked this up a while ago because I'm trying to complete my Disch collection, and I was sort of interested in what Scott Bradfield said on his channel about Tom Disch, because he knew Tom Disch, and I love all the early stuff, right through 60s, 70s, early 80s particularly. Then I hadn't read this, and Scott was saying how much Tom hated the Catholic Church. He was brought up in the Catholic Church and he hated it because Tom Disch was gay. And this is broadly sort of cast as a horror novel. I wouldn't really say that at all. It's you could say it's a horror novel. It's got speculative or fantastic elements, and parts of it are horrific. They're done in a very matter-of-fact way, and they're done in a very witty way with sort of Disch's traditional dry, mordant black wit, and I laughed a couple of times, and it is really good. And it's basically about a priest in America, a Catholic priest, who over the years he's sort of gradually risen in the sort of priesthood, and he's had, shall we say, erotic dalliances with a number of altar boys over the years, you know, and obviously this ties in with the whole thing about abuse in the Catholic Church, child abuse in the Catholic Church, so it does sort of address that. But at the same time, something else is going on. This, you're reading it, and he's got sort of a brother, and it's got the deft characterization, and it's very American, but in a bad way, in a really good way. It's very urbane, and there's a part where the central character, he goes to have a tattoo, and you think, what's a priest going to have a tattoo? And he's got this huge tattoo. He goes to this tattoo parlour, and what happens is that there's a kind of time exchange with two characters. One is back in the medieval period, these sort of heretical figures in France, and the two bodies get transposed, and that's just a small part of it, but it grows in significance as it goes on, and it's very witty, and I absolutely loved it. And it sort of gets very knockabout as well at times. It does turn into a bit of a caper towards the end, but I absolutely loved it. It's a great example of a literary novel that plays with genre conceits, doesn't really fit in anywhere, in the same way that Tom Disch didn't, and it was just wonderful, sophisticated and funny and brilliantly written and quite shocking in parts, but I absolutely loved it, and that's really got me back in the mood to reading more of Tom's work, particularly things I've never got round to, which tend to be the later things. So it was fantastic stuff. What a shame he's no longer with us. What a great guy he was. I then tried something else which has a witty side, and that's Worlds Apart by Richard Cowper. I call him Cowper. Richard Cooper is the real pronunciation. I call him Cowper so you can get the spelling right. So if you're looking for his work, and I got this in Hay. I think this is in my first Hay video that I put on the channel. So it's some time ago. So it's good. It's at least it's more than a year ago. It would have been towards the end of the first year on the channel, so back at the end of 2021. And this was a tenner, and I was very pleased with it because I do love a Galax Yellow Jacket. And this was one I hadn't read, and I read quite a lot of his work. And he was somebody who I always enjoyed, but I never felt quite nailed it for me, with the exception of a book called The Twilight of Briareus, which is a fantastic catastrophe novel, really, really good. And also there's a book called Profundis, which is set on a submarine. And there's quite a witty little book called Clone. These were sort of his keynote works in the mid-70s, and he came from a very literary family. His father was the Middleton Murray, you know, who knew Catherine Mansfield, and his real name was Colin. He used to get called Colin, so he had this sort of quite a literary upbringing. He wrote mainstream novels under the name Colin Murray as well, and he had quite a lot of acclaim in SF in the 70s particularly. He died relatively young. By the sort of early to mid 80s, his star had sort of crashed a bit, and he did a sort of Preistian, Robertsian kind of sequence, the White Bird of Kinship series, which are good. They're very gentle, very good. And if anything, my main criticism of Cowper was that he sometimes was a little bit too gentle and lacked power. He wrote really well, but he wasn't sort of quite firing on all cylinders, and I didn't think he was as good as the other big C's of British SF in the 70s, D.G. Compton and Michael Coney. Technically, he's a better writer than Michael Coney and more serious in intent, but somehow Coney's particular subjectivity and superheated approach to sex and romance and his florid nature makes him more of an individual in lots of ways than Richard Cowper, even though he's probably a better writer. But this was a funny one, and I have to say I really didn't like it. The writing is really good, and it's about a college lecturer who is in a marriage that he's not very happy with, and it depicts his family life, and his kids are a pain, and he has this sort of attraction to another teacher or lecturer where he works. And you know, if it was written entirely as a mainstream novel, with the sort of thing that, say, David Nobbs would have done or Peter Tinniswood, it would have been brilliant. But in his spare time, this chap, he's writing a science fiction story, and it has close parallels with his real life, but it's really, really annoying and nerdy, and it's the sort of thing that gives SF a bad name, the sort of thing that Douglas Adams and Terry Pratchett, if you like them, well, that's tough. But I think their humour's really adolescent, though Adams, you're a clever man, and the jokes are funny, but the whole sort of nerdiness of approach, sort of thing that appeals to, you know, a overly precocious 13-year-old, that by the time you're 18 you think, oh god, this is so uncool, you know. And that was a bit like this, lots of names and words with sort of dropped syllables and what have you, and I just found it intensely irritating. So I didn't finish it. I really got annoyed with it, but normally I like him, so I am revisiting his work because I did get rid of a lot of it because I felt that it was a lot more minor than I felt it should have been. But that one's definitely a no, and represented some of the sides of him that I didn't like. But it's a shame because the actual writing is really good, but it was a failed experiment. It depicts 70s milieu really well, and it feels very much of its time, not dated. And I love that aspect of it, because obviously I was young then, and I have a real fondness for 70s culture. It felt very authentic and gritty, so I like that part of it, but it was overall a fail. Something else I read which was short, and there's not a lot to see here. This is Robert Sheckley's The 10th Victim in Greg Press. You can just see it there. And if you never come across Greg Press, they did this huge series of SF hardcover reprints in the 70s. Did other things as well, and they're really good. They're quite hard to get in the UK. They're a US thing. And a lot of them ended up being sort of hardcover first, certainly in English. And I think this is one of them. And I've got one of The Genocides by Tom Disch. And they photographically reprint the actual things, and these books were usually paperback originals. And this is an interesting one because Sheckley, of course, he wrote a short story way back in the 50s called The Seventh Victim, which is about a kill game set in a future where, you know, just to keep people under control, because it's sort of pretty idyllic and utopian, but they've got these sort of rough and raw edges. And this sort of feeds into Rollerball, of course. You know, they're allowed to sort of legally kill people if they sign up for this hunt game where you can be a hunter one time, the victim the next. And if you get to 7 kills, I think the original story, and this is 10 kills, you kind of, you know, become like, you know, very, very important person indeed. But of course there's a risk because you could get killed. And this really is interesting because this is a film tie-in. And what Sheckley did, he took some material from the actual film, which is an Italian film, and it's just really good. It's campy, it's really great fun, and it's got Marcello Mastroianni and Ursula Andress, very glamorous and funky and very 60s kitsch. And he sort of basically used the plot and some other elements and grafted them onto his story. And of course his story, you know, resulted in the screenplay being written. So it's kind of a circular process. The result is that it's a lot more structured and disciplined and probably more sort of tighter than his usual stuff, because he does have this element of really just wandering off at a tangent, being episodic, getting bored really quickly. And it's very, very good, and it's very short. And inside there are pictures from the original tie-in edition and everything, so it's great stuff. So I thoroughly enjoyed that. It was a lot more disciplined and taut than the usual Sheckley thing, and in some ways I think it's one of his best novels, I have to say. So it's the input of other writers, so it's a collaborative sort of thing, I guess. There, it's probably heresy me saying that, but of course, what else was filmed? He wrote a short novel called Immortality Inc. Incorporated, which was filmed as Free Jack, which is a terrible film, and that's a great story as well. So that was really good. I really enjoyed it because I'd never actually read the novel. I managed to get a paperback recently, and then literally a week later I got this, so I passed the paperback on to my friend Nick. Then we come to the big feature. This is the book which supposedly everybody is talking about. This is In Ascension by Martin Macinnes. And as you see, it's a big chunky tome published by Atlantic Books. And as you see, it looks like a mainstream novel. There's a quotation from Karen Joy Fowler on the front. I'm going to read that to you. It's on the back as well. Now, Karen Joy Fowler, of course, she's best known for the Jane Austen book club, but that's probably her least typical book. Her first novel, Sarah Canary, which is now a Gollock's masterwork, which I read as a Henry Holt US hardcover when it was first published. It got reviewed in places like Locus. It was regarded as an SF novel, and it's more kind of an historical novel. And really, is it SF? It's people have interpreted it as SF. I'm not so certain, but it's an interesting one. I'm going to revisit it one day because I haven't read it since it came out, and it must have come out about 1992 or something. But Karen, she has written SF, so she does know what she's talking about. And she says, I don't think I've ever read a book that was as profound and moving at every scale. The cell, the family, the universe. A remarkable, expansive, stunning achievement. Jonathan Lethem, who edits the Library of America Philip K. Dick collection and also has written SF, but he gets published as a mainstream writer as well. He says, a gorgeous, somber epic. It reconciles the cosmic and the intimate with effortless grace, and so on. And, you know, this has had some rave reviews, and, you know, it's regarded as very much the thing. It's his third novel. I read his second novel, Gathering Evidence, last year. Now, Gathering Evidence didn't quite come off for me. It was very well written. It was a little bit too flavoursome and intense in its prose style, and it resembled a hybrid of Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer and The People in the Trees by Yanagihara to me. And there were sort of certain elements where I thought of M. John Harrison, because it didn't really explain everything to you, and that's what M. John does. He drops you in, and I wasn't very satisfied with it. I did review it on the channel, and then I thought the other day, well, you know, if that'd been M. John Harrison, you would have been quite happy with the fact that things weren't explained. It's more your predispositions. And there's interesting things in there about a fantastic opening chapter, which didn't become a frame. It's just an opening chapter about this app, and it was very similar to the kind of thing that Adam Roberts does at the beginning of This. And, you know, it was an experimental novel. Then it turned a very similar sort of thing to, as I say, Annihilation. Was a team of female scientists go into this zone where basically the last bonobo chimps are, and they're going to become extinct. And there's also a narrative in the background relating to one of the female characters, one of the female scientists, and about a mold, you know, growing on the wall where her boyfriend lives, and this sickness he has, and it doesn't really resolve. So it was interesting. So this popped out, and I had a look at it, and I thought maybe. And then, you know, I started looking at it more and more. And basically, I described it the other day when I was in Hunting Rainbooks in Froome in a sort of heading I put on the bottom of the screen, some text as a big dumb object book. Well, there is an object in it, but it's not big and it's not dumb. Well, it may be big, but I'm not going to give you too much. Anyway, the basic idea behind this is that this is about a woman called Lee, who is from the Netherlands, and she has a sister, a younger sister called Helena, and the first sort of 30 pages or so is sort of just character building stuff, and Lee is sort of narrating the story, and she's looking back across the way her life developed, how her father used to abuse her, you know, he was violent to her a few times, and how she had a kind of resentment towards her sister, who she said people always assumed her younger sister by 3 years, Helena, was somehow always perceived as the older one, and their father dies, and they have an interesting relationship with their mother, who seems quite withdrawn and what have you. So it's a lot of sort of domestic stuff to begin with. And what that reminded me of, it reminded me of the film of Solaris, the Tarkovsky version, where there's that large preamble on Earth where Chris Calvin is with his father at the cottage and what have you, before the actual voyage to Solaris starts. And of course, if you've read the novel of Solaris, you know it begins with that wonderful, vertiginous, super fast opening where Kelvin is shooting through space in a craft to Solaris to, you know, to get the mission underway, and it doesn't have a big preamble. So this is a bit of a preamble, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then you start to look into Helena's life, and she becomes a marine biologist. She's fascinated by that, and she talks about that. And it's a very easy read. It's a big book. It's 495 pages. And you know what I've said recently about big books. I don't do them very much. But it was very, very readable indeed, especially compared to Gathering Evidence, his previous book, which was his second novel. His first novel, Infinite Ground, came out in 2016. I did look at that at the time, but never made a lot of it. And Helena basically gets involved with marine research, and she becomes an expert at extremophiles, the sort of minuscule organisms which live in extreme parts of the earth, like in the extreme cold and near those vents in the bottom of the ocean where the volcanism is seeping out into the deep trenches of the earth and super hot water, and these sort of animals are living there, these single cell things are living there. And it's very, very sort of interesting. And she is on this mission on a ship called Endeavour, where a deep trench has been found, and this remote control submersible is sent down into this deep trench. And it transpires that the trench is deeper than anybody realised. And there's a lot of interesting stuff about the biology. So you get this great mix of her character and her family life background, what have you, meshing with the science, and it's done really, really deftly. And the way, say, Bob Shaw did it, the science isn't as technically sort of described as it would be in Shaw or in something like by, say, Gregory Benford, but it's there. There's just enough of it, and it infodumps really well. It's very subtle. It doesn't get too techy at any point. So this is the sort of book that anybody could read, including somebody who's never read SF, and it becomes a entirely typical narrative. It confronts all the big questions which come up in biology and cosmology in SF: space travel, alien contact, first contact, and there is a strange object in the sky. Everything in this is linked together, and that's the thing. And this is why I think this book's had such good reviews from the mainstream press. It suggests a wholeness and implicate order of things. And it's a very exciting read. In some ways, as I say, it's incredibly traditional. You know, if you're the sort of hard SF writer who, you know, likes things like Arthur C. Clarke, Greg Benford, the contemporary people, you get on fine with this. Say sort of special star drive is discovered. All that stuff is in here, but it's done in a very convincing, very gradual way. And as it goes further in, it becomes more and more and more like a traditional SF novel. And then the climax, well, I'm not going to tell you. The book it most reminded me of, in terms of its use of traditional SF tropes, but presented in a manner which felt more like a mainstream novel, really was to James Smythe's The Explorer, which is an interesting book, which doesn't quite come off to me. And it's got a rather Preistian ending, so I'm not going to say any more about the ending without the climax of what happens. But if you want that sort of sense of wonder thing, an exploratory thing, confronting all those sort of big things, and the reason that Lee, the scientist, gets so involved is that she's a specialist in algae yields, and there's a lot about how she ends up building algae yields. And you can see where things are going in the book. You know, if you've read SF, you will see where things are going up to a certain point, and then you won't see where it's going. And as I say, it's had loads and loads of reviews. Is it as good as the reviews say? Is it the best SF novel of 2022? Well, to know that, you'd have to read them all, and also what's best is personal taste as always. But what I would say is that anybody who's seriously interested in the genre should read this. I'm not certain if Atlantic Books have done themselves any favours by presenting this as a mainstream novel. It isn't a mainstream novel. It is an SF novel. It's being called literary fiction. It's well written, but it's no more literary than a lot of the other literary genre SF that's out there. And I think in a way, part of the problem with this is it'll come up against the traditional thing that always happens with this sort of book. A lot of people will pick it up, and when they realise it's a science fiction novel, they say, oh, I don't go there, I'll put it down. That's because their idea of SF is something they've seen on a screen, something cliched, and it's not something they've read in a book. The other problem, and you can see reviews on Amazon of this, is that there's an Amazon review where somebody draws a comparison with Cixin Liu's books, you know, and says really, you know, they're limited in lots of ways, and this is less limited in a literary sense, but it's less satisfying. Well, you know, that's up to you to decide. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I will say I think that the perfect imperfect ending wasn't quite as strong as it could have been. He is regarded as, you know, one of the writers who is shaping where fiction goes now, according to a poll. I don't think he is yet anywhere near as good as the kind of things that have really blown me away that have been published as mainstream novels this century, and I'm thinking particularly of Remainder by Tom McCarthy, and I'm thinking about The Anomaly by Hervé Letellier, which is also really good. But this is great. You know, I would say it's very, very smooth, fast moving despite its size. It will grip you, will satisfy you. I read it in a remarkably short period of time, such a long book. It wasn't hard at all. I just screamed through it. And in fact, the reason I'm doing this today on a Sunday is I didn't think I'd get it finished till the middle of next week, and I just went through it. So that's In Ascension. Is it the best SF novel of 2023? Well, you decide yourself. It's certainly one of the few that's drawn me in that's been published this year. And let's face it, there's not a heck of a lot of SF being published in the UK at the moment. It's nearly all fantasy. It's nearly all aimed at a young female market. Nothing wrong with the young female market, but unfortunately, a lot of that stuff just isn't any good. It's very, very entry level. So I would say give it a try. Maybe wait for the paperback. Maybe not. It's going to be really interesting to see how it sells and what people think of it. But make no mistake, this is an SF novel writ large. So that was February. I probably read some other stuff as well. And what am I going to read over the next month? It's really hard to say. March is coming up. I've got a lot going on. I need to catch up with the interviews on the channel, which I've been promising. Other things as well. The video is going to Scotland at one point. I've got a week off, so there's going to be an opportunity to do all sorts of things which I don't get a chance to do when we're both here. I'll be spending some time at home, relaxing, making some videos, what have you, maybe catching up with some reading then, and we shall see. And I'll be getting out and doing more out and about when the weather permits. And today, I have to say, it's really beautiful, but it's really cold, and I'm absolutely exhausted, very tired at work. As an old guy, you know, the few days I do a week now are enough for me. So anyway, that's what I read. Of all these books, the one I probably enjoyed the most was Tom Disch's The Priest. The one you should probably go out and get if you want to be up to date and look at what's happening now is In Ascension, which may surprise you, it may not. I'd love to know what you think. Bye for now.